basically, between our panelists, you know, the folks on here have funded companies like, you know, the who's who of gaming. So Supercell, King, Playfish, Super Evil Megacorp, and the list goes on and on. So I won't bore you with introductions. I'll just kind of ask you guys to maybe say a few words to introduce yourselves. Guillaume, would you like to start?
So I'm Guillaume Latour. I run a fund called Level Up. It's a fund dedicated to mobile game studios. We invest in Europe and also a bit in Asia. And we take studios from inception, usually investing at seed mode and then doing the Series A as well. One of the specificities is that we usually take the whole round and fund the studios for a long period, 4 to 5 years, with the objective of making them profitable. Yeah.
Alvaro Alvarez, Initial Capital. Initial Capital is a fund that is based here in London and in San Francisco. We invest in normally seed rounds that we tend to lead. Some of the background in the team includes having founded companies that, the first one, Macrospace, that became Glue Mobile, Playfish that was acquired by Electronic Arts, and as you know, as investors, we've backed the likes of Supercell, Space 8 Games here in London, Super Evil, as you were referring to. So we're definitely quite focused on the game space, and we're definitely early stage investors.
Hi, I'm Rob. I'm with Balderton Capital, which is one of the leading early stage venture funds, leading one that is focused on European companies. I am an amateur games investor. Normally I'm speaking at fintech conferences, but I had the privilege to be on the board of Wooga for the last 9 years, also on the board of Moji Works in messenger games. And as a fund, we previously invested in Natural Motion. It's been our most successful games investment to date. Also investors in Big Fish Games in the past.
Hi, I'm Chris. So I'm an angel investor. I previously built my own studios, predominantly in console games, which we sold to Electronic Arts, Activision, and to Sony, which kind of gave me a bit of an appetite to be involved in more studios. So I pretty much focused exclusively on mobile opportunities, and within mobile, almost exclusively free-to-play. And in the last kind of 7 or 8 years, made about 20 different investments at different stages, some of them on my own, some of them as a syndicate with other angel investors, and some of them, thankfully, with syndicating with some of these guys as well.
Hi, I'm Guzman from Index, not Excel. And I'm driving the games investment strategy at the firm. We're a 20-year-old venture capital firm that invests in companies all the way from the early stage seed and Series A to explosive growth situations and all the way to pre-IPO. So we have offices in London and San Francisco. I'm usually traveling in between both. And we've been investing in games for a while. It's been fortunate on our side to be able to back great companies like King and Supercell and many others, like more recently Roblox and Discord, together with some of the peers here in the panel.
Great, thank you so much. You know, this panel comes at a very actually amazing timing. Yesterday we heard the news about Voodoo with their investment. Today we heard the news about Gram Games. So I want to actually just kind of try something fun at the panel and kind of gamify it a little bit. So may I please, I'm going to read out a bunch of kind of emerging trends, and if you guys believe that those trends are for real and if they're kind of fundable and investable, would you please raise your hand? If not, don't raise your hand. So hyper-casual. Do you guys believe in hyper-casual games? Great. Making a note. Messaging games. Interesting. Okay. Augmented reality. Virtual reality. Interesting. And I have to ask blockchain technology as it applies to games. So that semi-hand or full hand? Okay, so Rob, can I start with you? You didn't raise your hand when we talked about hyper-casual. Can you please elaborate on that and why you kind of feel that way about?
So as I said, I'm the amateur on this panel. I feel a bit intimidated. I struggle with low retention rates, and everything I've seen about hyper-casual, the retention rates are terrible. And I find it hard to get excited by a company with terrible retention rates, even if it is managing to get really good free distribution, and even if it is managing to churn a lot of ad revenue out. I worry about the ad revenue side with GDPR. I worry about how lasting it is. I worry about relationship with the platforms. So there's a lot of things I worry about there.
And Chris, may I ask you to kind of elaborate on why you raise your hand?
Well, I think the thing that excites me is obviously if you have to get the right business. So and it's how they think. Hyper-casual studios think differently, and that excites me. They actually think about the business of games. They are less hung up on the creative. And obviously there's a balance. The creative still has to be exceptional. They still have to find that zeitgeist game that's going to kind of knock them into the stratosphere. But I think far too many game studios that I see are spending too much time on the creative, too much time thinking, okay, it's going to be that one next big thing that's going to be our breakthrough. And what I love about the hyper-casual studios that I've spent time with is that they just think differently. So I'm a big fan of anybody that thinks differently. And as a model, anyone that is looking at games as a media business and as an eyeball business, I'm enthusiastic about.
Thank you. Very interesting. That's actually a great segue for me to come to you, Alvaro, and say, maybe could you also elaborate on why you are excited about hyper-casual games, and also maybe talk a little bit about your investment criteria. Would you fund a team which is making hyper-casual games that fit your investment criteria?
Yeah. Well, I guess the first thing is I find that the whole concept of the questions you're asking, raising a hand, slightly tricky, because I think there's an argument to say that all of these trends are real. I think all of these trends will potentially have winners, and I'd like to back those winners in every single one of them. It is true that all of us have an investment strategy, and clearly some of us favor some of these trends over the others. But that's not to say that I believe that hyper-casual is happening and that it's going to be the next big thing, which it kind of is, and that VR is not going to happen. So the reason that I'm excited about hyper-casual is I think the level of defensibility that the larger players can build is significantly lower than when you look at a Supercell or a King and you try and compete with them from a user acquisition perspective. I guess that you do need sufficient, a large enough user base, a mass market to market to and to cross promote to when you're doing hyper-casual. But it is true that in a way it kind of takes less to get there to a position where you can start that cross promotion and with the right level of creativity, just be able to stay there at that level with these companies that you mentioned just got. Then, as for the second question, would I invest in a company in that space that I believe in? Yes, absolutely. To me, it's just a question of understanding whether they are methodical enough to just go through the different stages to get them to that leadership position where some of these companies are today. And B, whether I'm excited enough. I mean, to me, in a way, given that we invest in very early stages, a lot of it is still about the talent and about the creativity of that talent. And so, again, across all of these disciplines, if there is a team that is strong enough that believes in it and that has the right ingredients to break through, then absolutely. I'll
ask Guillaume to comment on this as well, because I know that privately we've talked about this genre, but could you share your thoughts on the success factors in hyper-casual games?
Yeah, there are many things that those people, I mean, the Voodoo and the Ketchup guys, are teaching the industry about how you launch a game, how you do user acquisition without any capital originally and without any big teams. So those were surprises to many studios who thought, if I have to raise any money, there's going to be a development budget, but there's going to be a UA project budget as well, and I need a couple of millions from the investors, otherwise my game cannot exist. It proves wrong. So there's this movement, this trend from people who started from games who didn't cost a lot to develop, but who spent their entire focus on the launch is actually bringing a lot of value, I think. We are in an industry that is, if you compare, it's a media space, and if you compare it to the cinema, the movie industry, for instance, we're just a teenager yet. I mean, many things are going to structure themselves. A lot of skills are going to be broadcasted along many other studios in the future and so on. So I think that what those people in hyper-casual show is super interesting. I kind of compare it more, if you look at the controversy 10 years ago about people who were making movies and who were watching the people on YouTube building new content in a quite unprofessional way at first, but then being very successful, having millions of viewers and so on, and now becoming YouTubers, professional YouTubers with production teams behind them, and that everybody respects, is probably comparable to what happens with hyper-casual as well. So I think, I mean, gaming is about making games, but it's about also selling them, and the online games today had to reinvent the distribution models and how you launch, and this reinvention, more or less, is also explored by the hyper-casual games. So it's very interesting to me. I think it's very valuable.
Guzman?
Yes.
Can you comment on kind of like, have you looked at hyper-casual companies? What is kind of your investment criteria when you are looking at whether or not that's a investable company for you?
Yeah, so we've looked at the hyper-casual for many years, and I think our opinion on the category has changed a lot depending on which hat we've worn, I think. First of all, I have to agree with Rob on what concerns me whenever I look at a hyper-casual game company, right? Is the game good enough to retain people? Is the game good enough to monetize? Is the game... And it ends up coming down to the point of like, do people like the product and come back, right? And so if people like the product and come back, it can be very simple, it can be very complicated. The fact is there are hyper-casual games with excellent retention out there. There's maybe less games that are hyper-casual with excellent monetization. I'm sure there are some. The challenge out there is, you know, the cost of building these games is low, obviously, and so at that point, like knowing how to distribute them becomes more important than knowing how to make them, right? At the end of the day, you see how Voodoo releases a game, then Ketchup releases the same game with a different skin, then they probably both release the same game again with a different skin of their own game, and that's a kind of established practice in a way. It's not about the game making so much as it is about understanding where do your users come from, what content are you serving them, do they like this content, how can you keep them coming back, etc. Right? We're even in a, you know, I like Guillaume's comparison to YouTube, a company that some people perceive as a game company, other people might perceive as a social network. I think I kind of think of it as a somewhat of a hyper-casual game platform as an investment of ours in a company called Roblox, where you know, there's tens of millions of users every month playing content built by other users, and most users who build content are not particularly good at game development. They're not game developers, most often they're kids. In that sense, it is actually like YouTube, where it's user-generated content of initially not particularly high quality, and progressively as people keep building content, they get better at it. And the engagement with the platform and those games, you know, some of those games are super simple. It's like, it's maybe an obstacle course, and you need to go through it and jump around the platforms. And kids play that for, you know, 4 or 5 hours a day, 3 days a week for years. So I do think it's possible to build those things. For me, it always comes down to engagement, regardless of the genre or the category.
So building on that, if actually you were to start a gaming studio today, would you kind of share your thoughts on what genres would you go into and how would you go about raising capital from Excel and Index and others?
That's a tough question. I think it's hard enough to make a game to then sub-select the genre based on market research. I think you should make a game that you really are passionate about doing, a game that you feel capable that you're going to build the best in breed, regardless of what that is, right? I mean, there's plenty of examples of super crowded genres where something new comes in and it's just that bit much more new that it just, blasts through the competition. Look at Fortnite. It's not the first shooter game out there. It's not the first shooter game with craft mechanics out there. It's not the first battle royale game out there, but it's just that little bit different from everything else that makes it more unique and more appealing. And obviously it comes from a studio that has decades of experience building games, but they were not thinking about, oh, well, maybe there is that niche that we should exploit. It's, they were making a game they enjoyed, and eventually someone saw that Battle Royale seemed like a better game mode. I mean, originally Fortnite was a very different game. So I encourage people to pursue the type of game they want to build, not the game that makes sort of sense to build. In terms of how to raise capital, I'd say it depends on every company, but approach us early, talk to us. We're very happy to meet companies as soon as they start, even if it's maybe a little bit early for us to invest sometimes not. We want to back people who want to build companies that build games, not people who want to build games, period, right? It's more about, are you able to captivate talent from other companies, have them join you, have them stick around with you, building a vision that transcends a single game, building the skill set of building and distributing content over time. So I think that's something that I cannot stress enough. Just like we have this game and it looks really cool, it's not enough. There has to be some more deep thought around it. You might start with an idea, and that's fine, but you need to mature that idea as you go.
Chris, let me ask you a similar question. You have been on the kind of the game-making side as well as the investing side. Do you see kind of exciting trends that you see in your pipeline with the companies that you have invested in? And if you were to start to make games again, what kind of game would you make and why? And if you can share some thoughts, that would be great.
Yeah, so I think on the trend side, the thing actually I'm really excited about at the moment and seem to be making a kind of over-indexing on the level of investments that I'm doing is people coming into games that have never been in games before. And what excites me about that is, obviously there's huge challenges there because there's a network they need to build, there's capabilities and understanding they need to build, but they're approaching the opportunity with a completely unencumbered mindset. They're not trying to do what's been done before, and their thought and their process and the approach that they're taking is just really refreshing. And I guess what I try and do is where I can add some value, hopefully, is connect them to some other people that have more familiarity with actually making the games. And so that's, I guess, one theme that I find really interesting. So recent investments have been people coming from a sports background wanting to build a sports game, but actually their expertise is actually understanding the sport, not necessarily understanding the creation of a game. Or people coming from a media or TV or a different kind of entertainment background and wanting to bring that into games. And I find that really exciting. In terms of what I would build, I wouldn't build a game. Because I'm not terribly good at building games, and I personally love the business of games. And Guzman's absolutely right. Is whatever business you build, you have to love it because it is hard and it is blood, sweat, and tears. So if you start with something you don't love, then you'll just never get to the end. The thing I'm surprised that people aren't doing, or I haven't been pitched a proposal that I've been really enriched and compelled by. But I would do it if I had the time to do it. Is the business I would build is I would data mine the app stores and I'd build a dashboard, and I would find the outliers. I would find the games that have got the extraordinary metrics that just for whatever reason are not being supported by the teams. It may be one or two people have built the game. They don't have user acquisition. They don't have an ability to scale. They don't know how to do cross-promotion. They don't know how to do partnerships. They don't have a relationship with the platform holders. There's a million reasons why those games didn't succeed, but actually the core KPIs of those games are really, really compelling. Now, if you think of how many hundreds of thousands of games are on the app stores, you have to believe that there are at least single-digit, if not double-digit thousands of games that should be doing better than they are. So that's the business I would build. I would build a data mining system to go and find them, and I would buy them.
Thanks. Please go ahead, Rob.
Can I just jump in on that? So to that first point around people who haven't started games companies before, it seems like the way to get funded right now is to have had a previous very successful mobile game. And then you get funded as you walk out of your current company, you get funded with a generous investment round. That's what's getting funded right now, particularly in mobile games in Europe. And I look at Wooga that we backed, that was people who are completely new to games, and has been a great story for us. Natural Motion was a founder who is completely new to games. And I think it's a really interesting point that actually you've seen people come in with fresh perspectives, and there's probably not enough of that going on now. I think there's a bit of a perceived wisdom in the investment community that to have success, you have to have been doing games for many years. And it's good to hear someone contrary to that.
No, great. And just to kind of build on that a little bit and ask you, there's a lot of talk around how tough it is to actually build and launch and build a business of games. Do you guys think, are we kind of, in the era where PC mobile is really overly saturated, and do you agree with the statement that mobile is kind of really saturated now, and therefore people are looking at additional platforms?
I think it's hard. But it's not. There's definitely potential there. You've seen the breakthrough games coming through over the last few years. And it's about talent and time and sheer hard work. It's not about unfair sort of blockages. It's not about someone controlling the distribution channels. It's about people who've been making games on those platforms for a very long time and do it very well. And you've got to do it better.
And Alvaro, I want to ask you, there seems to be something going on in the European ecosystem in a positive way. We see a lot of success stories, Voodoo Ketchup obviously coming out of France, Supercell and the Scandinavian success stories, King out of London, Playrix and companies like Peak Games, etc. It seems that Europe is really punching above its weight in terms of games. Would you agree with that? And if so, what do you think drives that ecosystem?
That's right. Investors, obviously. I think, in a way, Europe has always punched above its weight when it comes to games in particular. And, if you ask some of the big guys here, they've been talking about some of the investments they made, and I'm sure that, in their respective portfolios, some of the best returns they ever got were from some of those games companies. And that's been happening for a long time. Some of the companies are kind of older than others, but consistently the funds that have been established for a longer time have had a number of successful stories. Now, I guess that when it comes to talent, there's a lot of talent in Europe, and talent attraction and retention and breeding that talent kind of in-house is easier. And this, again, has happened since the days of the demo scene. It's been brewing for a very long time in different cities in Europe. And it's funny you mentioned that, these different success stories, because, if you look at, like you said, at Supercell, you look at something like Wooga, you look at something like King, most of these companies are actually in different cities, in different countries. So the ecosystem is very healthy in Europe in different locations. Now, obviously, then you've got the end user, the consumer, the player on the other side. And Europe is still the market that it is, and European studios need a lot of users in different geographies. And some of those geographies, particularly in Asia, are significantly more challenging because of the peculiarities of their own idiosyncrasies locally. So I think from a talent perspective and from the perspective of investing in games in Europe on this side of the table, there's never been a time that has been this exciting. But in general, I think it's probably general wisdom that most of the best companies that create games are in Europe. Then the question becomes, what about the other side? What kind of level of support, of knowledge, of partnerships do you need in order to attract those consumers that are increasingly becoming increasingly relevant as part of your revenue?
Guillaume, I want to turn to you. You've invested in companies like Social Point, Pretty Simple Games. What, in your opinion, has driven the success of European companies in gaming and to punch above their weight?
Well, there's been a total change of structure in the industry. So before you had studios who needed a big budget to develop a game on PC and console. And before Unity, you had also problems where you were developing on console for 2 years and then porting your game to another console for another extra year of development cost and so on. So you needed this partnership between publishers on one side who were taking part of on the business side and also funding the development, and the creatives who were just stuck in studios that were in a kind of a master-slave relationship, right? It totally changed with mobile, where the studios, although being independent, could take care about the distribution and about the publishing as well. So they could control the entire value chain, which made them very successful and very quickly profitable in the first wave, where you didn't have so much need for skills and user acquisition and so on at the beginning, when Facebook was so easy to drive as a business and so on at first. So those small companies became, profitable very quickly. And what has probably, if you compare to tech investments, for instance, most of the VCs who do game investments today are coming from the tech investment side as well. So they invest in tech almost like they would invest in games. And if you compare Silicon Valley and Europe in technology, the real strength about Silicon Valley is the ability to develop B2B relationships very, very quickly and to deploy them very quickly as well, which is always slower and more difficult to do in Europe. Since you didn't need any kind of B2B structure in online gaming anymore, it went up very quickly. So all the talent could actually flourish and be profitable without any constraint on the B2B side. So this is what made, in my opinion, mobile games very successful in Europe without any of the ecosystem needs that you would have in technology originally.
You mentioned the kind of approach some of the VCs might take for tech versus gaming. One of the things that we hear in the ecosystem is that games are a hit-driven business, and therefore potential LPs, etc., may not, invest in that. How do you guys? I'll just ask it openly. How do you guys react to that kind of criticism that games are a hit? Are they a hit-driven business?
I always say that every business is a hit-driven business. Like, if you, we're increasingly going towards a world where like you're either number one or number two, or simply the return you give to a type of fund like ours is not that meaningful, right? So that's why we really try to, invest with the conviction that we are backing a company that will become number one in their category. And I think that's true not just for games, but for everything else: software as a service, social networks, open source software companies. Any type of company today, if we were to compare with enterprise software and say, look at a new CRM business and how is it going to compete with Salesforce, right? And there are arguments as to why, but the reality is that it's tough. It's not easy, right? Like, you're a new social network, you compete with Facebook and Snap. It's not easy. I don't think games is harder. It's not easier for sure, but it's not necessarily harder. I think we're fortunate to be in an industry where innovation happens very quickly, and where distribution can happen in a very fast pace when the product clicks with the consumer. And I think it's one of the few areas in technology where a new company doing the right thing can become very large very quickly, you know, bypassing the incumbents.
Anything to add?
I think, of course, you're right, and we are hit-driven. I think what I get constantly disappointed with is that a lot of studios are also hit-dependent, which means that if they don't get a hit, they die. And I think that's an awful, awful failure of the entrepreneurs that built those studios in the first place. That's not, and it goes back to your comment around, you know, we're building businesses here. Of course, the business is ultimately a servant to creating games and ultimately trying to find that hit. But if you're hit driven, but also hit dependent, then you've got problems. So what I like to see in a business is someone that is aspiring to move the needle, to deliver something that is groundbreaking, some kind of zeitgeist piece of entertainment. But at the same time, they've got a long-term strategy. They've got a way in which they can mitigate against, you know, that bet not paying off, and to keep the lights on in order to make the next bet. And if you see the companies that are managing to go public, actually going public is a really interesting process in games, because I've been in a lot of these types of rooms recently with MAG Interactive, where we do regular town hall meetings with actually retail investors, people that might only put a small amount of money into a public listing like that. And all of the questions are exactly that question. So you're a hit-driven business. And the reason someone like MAG Interactive have had a successful flotation, you look at Sumo Digital in the UK, you look at Codemasters coming soon, you've got Team 17, is that they're passionate, hit-focused, hit-driven studios, but then they've built over a long, long period a catalog of products, a capability, which means that they're not hit-dependent. So they're very, very investable. They're very, very easy to support as a retail investor or as an institutional investor or a pension fund. You can see that your money is reasonably well protected based on catalog and capability, but there's always a chance that actually the next game or the one after that is going to be defining. And I think that's the businesses that you owe it to yourself to build those types of businesses.
Thank you. Should we expect to see more gaming companies to try to take the public routes, building on your comment about MAG Interactive, for example? Can you also maybe comment, because you're familiar with, I'm sure, the discussions, what are the kind of pros and cons of taking that decision and going public for a company like MAG?
Ask Rovio.
What was the point?
Ask Rovio.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting environment when you're in the public domain. So the pros and cons, and then what was the first part of the question?
Should we expect to see more companies trying to look towards that as a potential like flotation? Because MAG Interactive is a smaller company that went public, and you've also mentioned 2 or 3 other companies. Is that a trend, or is there more deeper strategic reasons?
So I think there seems to be a PC console trend. So if you look at Frontier, Sumo, Team 17, Codemasters, there's a bit of a PC console trend there, and obviously those businesses have been around for such a long period of time that I think they can get a less familiar investor comfortable with the fact that they're going to be here for a long period of time. And if you look at Sumo Digital's business model, it's a different business model to maybe Supercell, where obviously Sumo have got the protection of continued work for hire relationships. So are we going to see a few more of those? I suspect we will. Will they be of the same substance and caliber of the ones that we've seen already? Probably not. You tend to see a lot of people kind of fast follow with maybe less solid propositions, which is a shame, because you only need one domino to fall, and there is a large shadow that's cast on everybody else. And then in terms of the pros and cons of being a public business, I mean, in terms of comparing it to a strategic exit, there are benefits of creative control. You continue to feel independent. You still have, obviously, a lot of liquidity in the remaining shareholding, so you can kind of trade that at a later stage, hopefully at a larger value. But similarly, some of the studios that I've seen being acquired into larger businesses, they gain a lot of benefits by being surrounded by more seasoned management, better expertise, and not having the discipline of having to report publicly. They actually just get back to making games. So the pros and cons.
Great. Just to shift gears a little bit, Rob, you mentioned in a post, you alluded to the fact that Balderton went back into investing in games with your recent investment in Mojiworks. Was that driven by a belief? Obviously, it was part of the belief was the belief in the team, but the messaging ecosystem, was that a big bet on that? Can you share your thoughts about messaging, gaming platforms?
Yeah. So obviously it was a bet on the team, and you can't do anything on games without an exceptional team. But it was also a thesis bet, which is quite rare for us. But I think particularly in games, we look for new types of games, new platforms, new ways of playing games that gives a particular chance to newcomers coming in. And yes, Zynga are doing a lot of work on instant games right now, but they're doing it from a company that has 10 years of history and has certain momentum, and it has certain revenues in existing games, which I think it makes it harder for them to be bold and experiment. Whereas Mojiworks or another kind of startup really focused on Facebook Messenger games can iterate really fast, work out what works on that platform, what doesn't work that used to work in the past. And it also provides a free acquisition channel and an opportunity to grow virally extremely quickly, which we saw with Wooga in the early days on Facebook, with Zynga, with Playfish, that new platform that allowed very rapid viral growth. That window was only open for a couple of years, but in that couple of years, it started $1 billion company and several multi-hundred-million-dollar companies. And it would be, I think that's what we do as venture investors. We look for those windows of opportunity for new companies to break through.
Alvaro, I'll ask you, you didn't raise your hand when I asked about messaging games. Could you comment on what risks do you see in that ecosystem, in messaging-based games?
Yeah, and once again, I want to make the point that there are opportunities in all these areas. I think that with messaging games, Rob spoke about some of the potential, which is clear. When a new platform of any kind, and you mentioned some of them, when they're born, it's a greenfield. There's a lot of opportunity. I guess that from a messaging perspective, those companies suffer from some of the same elements as you find in hyper-casual around the content and sort of retention, as well as sort of being able to grab the attention of the end user, given how easy it is to produce and put out content. And then you've got, in the end, you've got a platform dependency as well. And we've seen in the ecosystem a number of companies that have struggled with the different messages that have come out of the big platforms in the last few months, where it's given that it's an ecosystem that is still being formed, it's not even clear to them how they're going to approach it. And so that third-party dependency is kind of a threat to any business that almost overnight can be very damaging to the business. So I guess in general there is a lot of opportunity, and I see messaging as a platform that will have that will increase its presence as a platform to play games, and particularly on the social side when you want to play with friends. But then again, there are obviously challenges to every new platform that comes out.
Okay, one last question from me. I'll make it a quick one, and then I'd like to open it for Q&A. Could you maybe share the one that got away? So like which company you didn't invest in, you passed, and that you look back and you say, okay, maybe I should have invested in that. And ideally why you passed as well.
So I'll go first. And in a way, like it feels like I've been doing this all afternoon, but I'm kind of going to dodge the question and say that there are a lot of good companies that presented to us over the years and that didn't work out for whatever reason, and there are many reasons. It ranges literally from a personal fit question all the way to a valuation conversation or competition in the marketplace, investment thesis, location. There are a ton of different reasons why a relationship between an investor and an entrepreneur doesn't necessarily work. So there are a number of them that I can tell you, and I remember them very well, that have gone on to do great things and to become, some of them, billion-dollar companies. The reality is that I think what you need to work on is your own investment thesis and understand that there will be a lot of companies that don't make it, that you don't support, and some companies that you still don't support but will make it and will make it big. And thankfully, I think probably for all of us, we see a good amount of deal flow in the space, and inevitably a lot of good entrepreneurs sort of are not invested by even anyone on the panel. So the last thing I'll say is it's easy to regret not having invested in something, and I guess subconsciously all of us do that when you see that someone is having success. Now, success, the definition of success is not very clear. You know, the fact that someone has a lot of users today, or that someone is valued, you know, the valuation is very high today, doesn't necessarily mean that it was a good investment in the first place. It's a bit of a long race, and you have to wait until the end and see the end outcome. There are certainly a few companies that I can think of that are doing very well today, but still they're not necessarily part of what I thought was a rational thesis in the sector.
I won't push you. But Guillaume?
So the first VC who started to do this funny thing about telling about the deals they missed was Bessemer, I think, on their website, right? And everybody thought, wow, that's a super nice idea to be humble enough to talk about, oh, I missed this thing and so on. So we're like, investing is like recruiting, more or less. So you are just a headhunter, and some companies can be very lucky with teams that you don't think deserve this sometimes, and sometimes you have teams that really deserve success that never make it. So for me, I mean, it's more like learning a lesson about reading people. So you have business plans, you have people who get skills along the way. I mean, on the first wave of online games, of course, everybody could come up in the field and make a success without knowing so much about what the people who were doing PC games have been doing for 30 years and so on. It could work. Today, to come out of nowhere and to start something is more difficult than 4 years ago, for instance. But so as recruiters of CEOs and management teams and founders, I think when you miss, when you refuse an investment that gets, you know, eventually super successful, for me it's okay. I mean, I prefer much more missing opportunities than just investing in bad investments, I mean, bad companies as well. So you know, if you miss, at least you didn't lose anything. So I just waited opportunity. That's it. But I think it makes. I mean, I refused an investment in Voodoo, for instance, years ago, when they were making games. So they were trying to make games, and it wasn't super successful. They had really bad numbers and so on, and they could not figure out how to get out of it. And this kind of flip that they did internally in the company to look at why it didn't work, and all the analytics they looked into so to understand why it didn't work, and then out of work, they actually understood that something was there to be exploited and so on, and then they totally switched the business to the publish later on. This you cannot really predict that it can happen. I mean, those success, every kind of super success, even King, I mean, didn't know that it would become successful before. I mean, there have been many years for those studios without any success before, you know. It's like, so content-driven successes are not always predictable. What is interesting is to check whether once you have a success, you can actually replicate. So this kind of comes back to the question of hit-driven businesses. You know, do you make one hit and then you have no clue on how to replicate it? There are some studios right now who are a certain genre. You know, if you look at card RPGs, for instance, there are some studios who are making millions right now in revenues and have no clue why it actually works. They have no clue. And you know, they just found a twist that actually works. They can't explain, but it works. So if you have the organization behind to like try every kind of simulation, configuration, and so on, and if you can expand on success and leverage on that, that's good. But I mean, it's like betting on a painter or betting on a writer or betting on a composer. It's content production. We have to have a number of failures before you have a success. For me, I don't really care about missing a studio that makes a lot of money. It's more like opening yourself as an investor to different kind of profiles when you look at management teams. Some people evolve. It's about the potential, not really about what they show you today, right? So Voodoo guys would have been able to check or predict that they would transform themselves like, gods of UA today. No, impossible. It would, it's part of I don't know if anybody would have guessed that before, but probably not me.
All right, I want to leave some time for questions, but really quickly, if you guys want to also talk about the one that got away.
Well, mine are easy because Guzman's next to me. So Discord and Roblox. And if just someone had mentioned them at some point earlier, I just wish I knew someone that had invested or could have given me a heads up, or someone just someone close to me that could have, just someone that would have mentioned it. That's all.
To me, actually, it's one thing that I think growing up I would have never guessed it would work, yet it did in a big way. Is interactive video streaming. So I will say things like Twitch and more recently HQ Trivia. I think those are the ones where, because they are so new, you tend to look at them with a more perhaps risk-averse approach. And you're like, I mean, you look at 2009 or 10. People are not going to watch other people playing video games live. That's silly. Why wouldn't you play games directly, right? Today, it's very widely understood that actually more people watch games than play in many games, right? Especially when you look at other markets. I mean, if you guys ever look at the number of people who play PUBG versus the amount of people who watch PUBG in China, it's like mind-boggling just how many people. It's like a order of magnitude more that watch versus play, right? And I think that I could have not foreseen, and I'm very sad that I probably should have been more risk-taking and be more willing to see what could go right instead of what could go wrong. So I'm going to say those two. I think this future of more personal communication and interaction between people through video, through actually playing with people that you see, and interacting directly is a topic that I wish we had sort of seen with different eyes back in the day.
Very short answer, Supercell.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much. Quick, I guess we have some time for questions and answers.
Really quick one. I forget which three said they were interested in AR, but AR mobile or AR headsets? What was interesting? What's interesting about those?
Headsets when they come out.
Yeah, I guess my reaction was more mobile. I think we've only just scratched the surface of what's possible. Pretty much every experience so far remains quite clunky, but I think that will be fixed, and I think there is still an opportunity to be kind of a winner in that category, and it hasn't been one yet.
For me, the problem is user interface. So your mobile gaming worked because it was ubiquitous. You can play wherever you want, whenever you want, and it can be discrete, and you don't have to have headphones or a speaker or whatever. You can play in your hand. You can play portrait mode with one finger only. If you're in AR mode, you have to hold your phone in front of your eyes. It's in terms of interface very, very demanding, and AR games force you to walk out of your job and your house and so on to go on the street and be physical. So it's both very physically demanding and a bit awkward to hold this phone like that. So I think in terms of device, mobile definitely. Whether it's through a mobile phone, I'm not sure.
What are your thoughts on women in gaming and games built for women as a trend in Europe? In the United States, as an example, 65% of women aged 10 to, I think it's about 50 some odd, are gamers.
So I'm very conscious this is an all-male panel, which I normally hate to be on, so apologies. Wooga is mostly focused on a female audience. It has Paul would know the statistic, but a pretty balanced workforce as games companies goes, and has been very successful in the female demographic. And so I think it's a huge opportunity there, and there's not enough people going after it right now.
Yeah, I agree. I think we still lack a female kind of balance in terms of studios. I was really fortunate to co-create a studio called Media Molecule, and that was led by a girl called Siobhan Reddy, and the influence and impact that she had culturally in the studio, which subsequently led into how we developed the game and how we thought about developing the game was just incredible. And I've always searched for that in terms of making sure that the studio represents the audience as much as it possibly can. If you're building a game for a female audience, for an Asian audience, for a North American audience, you really have to try and understand and have that reflected within the culture of the company that you're building as well. And as an industry, we haven't quite got that yet.
Hi, Brian Saltgamaga. We're a company based in Chile. We've got a top 500 grossing game. Looking for investment, and I'm finding location is an issue for investors. Do you share that view, and could you explain why?
Sorry, maybe we can both give our perspectives. I think particularly in the early stage, it's helpful that your investors are near you, and that they can help you beyond the financial aspect. A lot of the work I personally do with most of the studios I work with is not just finance the early stage development of the game and the go-to-market, but actually spend at least a day a week with each of them, talking, debating, putting them in front of people who are geographically meaningful to them in terms of engineering talent, producers, game designers, other people in the local ecosystem they can either hire or consult with. And it's really hard for people who are completely foreign to a new location to be meaningful and impactful in that way. I think that's part of the reason that people tend to not invest early stage in a relatively remote location from where they are. That said, I think it's something that changes over time, right? You need to feel that there's an ecosystem from which new companies can nurture themselves. And as you look at, I'll put as an example places like Buenos Aires in Argentina, where Itermax managed to build up a pretty strong company around Trivia Crack. And I think if a studio was based there, they'd at least be able to benefit from some of the talent that comes out of there. I'm not very familiar with the location in Chile. I think, Alvaro, you probably are a bit more familiar. You actually have invested in a studio out there. Maybe you can give a bit more insight.
Yeah, well, I have invested in Chile before, so but so
it's possible.
But everything Guzman said is absolutely right. I think for the investment that we made in Chile, I think everything was right. The entrepreneurs were fantastic. The rationale for the investment, the thematic, the game, everything looked perfectly fine, and it was still a struggle. And the reason it's a struggle internally, because obviously all of us have our own investment committees. It's not like if I want to invest in you, I'll do it right away. We have to debate internally. And the reason it's a struggle is precisely because of location. Because if I look at, honestly, at myself and my team and where we're based and where our networks are and where, as Chris described earlier, we can plug people into our own network and our ecosystem. If I'm going to introduce you to somebody at one of the distribution platforms, then it's much easier for me to do it in the UK, the US, where I have a presence, where I attend events, where I'm part of the ecosystem, than it is in Chile, where I don't travel often, right? Now, I think what it takes for someone like you to grab the attention of some of the top investors elsewhere is to show a willingness, a number of things. First, what attracts me to certain geographies is the opportunity, meaning valuation is an important factor. Valuations tend to be lower. Burn rate is an important factor. People tend to make less money. And so with the same amount of money, you can do more. Now, I think what you need to show from your perspective is a willingness to cooperate and to understand that it is a two-way process where you need to meet on a regular basis, where you need to share ideas frequently and say, look, you know, maybe rather than being in the office a day a week, I need to speak to this guy every Friday afternoon for a couple of hours on a video call. And then I need to travel to London or San Francisco, wherever they're based, and meet them at every conference there is whenever I am attending. And then I need to try and plug myself into their network and into their ecosystem, even if it is in New York. And I have to travel to New York whenever they organize an event. So it takes more effort, I believe. It is doable, it is possible, we've done it. But it is definitely a challenge. At the very early stages, I fully agree, venture capital is a local business, and you want to be, as an investor, you want to be as close to your entrepreneurs as you possibly can.
Okay, guys, it's very rare for investment talent of this caliber to come together. So I want to thank you very much for your time and for your answers, and thanks very much for attending. That's it.